Late summer 1945, Guam, Northern Mariana Islands. Dr. Takeshi Yamamoto stood in the doorway of what had once been a Japanese military hospital, now an American prisoner of war camp. His white medical coat, salvaged from the rubble, hung loose on his malnourished frame. In his hand, he clutched a torn surgical textbook, its pages stained with ash and blood. Across the compound, an American medical officer approached, not with weapons or chains, but with a stethoscope draped around his neck and a medical journal tucked under his arm. What happened next would shatter everything Yamamoto had been taught about his enemy and redefine what it meant to be a physician in the aftermath of history's most brutal war. The surrender of Japan on August 15, 1945, had left thousands of Japanese military personnel scattered across the Pacific in various states of shock, despair, and confusion. Among them were dozens of military physicians who had served in field hospitals, surgical units, and medical research facilities throughout the empire's vast conquered territories. These doctors faced an uncertain fate. They had heard the propaganda, the warnings that American captors would show no mercy, that surrender meant dishonor worse than death. Yet here they were, alive, captive, and about to discover that the rules of engagement they had been taught were built on lies. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The story of how Japanese prisoner of war doctors were treated not as enemies, but as respected colleagues, represents one of the most remarkable and least known chapters of World War II's conclusion. It was a transformation that defied military logic, challenged cultural prejudices, and ultimately demonstrated that the Hippocratic Oath could transcend the deepest hatreds. To understand how this happened, we must first understand the men involved, the circumstances that brought them together, and the extraordinary decisions made by American medical officers who chose professional respect over vengeance. Dr. Takeshi Yamamoto had been born on March 3, 1912, in Yokohama, Japan, into a family of modest merchants. His father operated a small textile shop near the harbor, and young Takeshi grew up watching ships arrive from distant lands, carrying goods and stories from worlds he could barely imagine. He was a quiet child, thoughtful and observant, with a particular fascination for the human body and its mysteries. When a tuberculosis outbreak swept through his neighborhood in 1923, claiming his younger sister among its victims, 12-year-old Takeshi made a silent vow. He would become a doctor and fight the diseases that stole lives so indiscriminately. His path to medicine was not easy. The Yamamoto family lacked the wealth and connections that typically open doors to prestigious medical schools. But Takeshi possessed something more valuable, an iron determination and a brilliant mind that absorbed knowledge with remarkable efficiency. He studied relentlessly, often by candlelight long after his family had gone to sleep, memorizing anatomy texts borrowed from a sympathetic local physician who recognized the boy's potential. In 1930, Yamamoto earned admission to Tokyo Imperial University's medical school, one of Japan's most prestigious institutions. The acceptance represented a triumph over economic circumstance and social expectation. At the university, he excelled in surgical technique and diagnostic medicine, impressing professors with his steady hands and calm demeanor under pressure. He graduated in 1936, ranking 7th in his class of 83 students, and immediately began work at Tokyo Army Hospital as a junior surgeon. Japan, in the late 1930s, was a nation in transformation, gripped by militaristic fervor and imperial ambition. The invasion of China in 1937 created massive demand for military physicians, and young doctors like Yamamoto found themselves swept into service, whether they desired it or not. In 1938, Yamamoto was commissioned as a first lieutenant in the Imperial Japanese Army Medical Corps and deployed to Manchuria, where Japanese forces were consolidating control over occupied territories. His experiences in Manchuria shaped his understanding of war's brutality. He performed countless surgeries on soldiers ravaged by combat, treated civilians caught in crossfire, and witnessed suffering on a scale that medical school had never prepared him for. He saved lives when he could, watched helplessly when he could not, and gradually developed the emotional detachment necessary for military physicians to function in hellish conditions. Yet, beneath that necessary detachment, Yamamoto retained his core belief in medicine's essential purpose: to heal, to alleviate suffering, to preserve life, regardless of whose life it was. By 1941, when Japan launched its attacks on Pearl Harbor and throughout the Pacific, Yamamoto had risen to the rank of captain and earned a reputation as a skilled trauma surgeon. He was assigned to the 23rd Field Hospital Unit and deployed to the Philippines following Japan's invasion in December 1941. There, he established surgical facilities in Manila and later in field hospitals scattered across Luzon and Mindanao as Japanese forces consolidated control over the archipelago. The Philippines campaign showcased both Yamamoto's medical abilities and his growing discomfort with certain aspects of Japanese military conduct. He treated Japanese soldiers with the best care available resources allowed, but he also treated Filipino civilians and captured American prisoners when circumstances brought them to his surgical table. This created tension with some of his fellow officers who viewed such treatment of enemies as wasteful and inappropriate. Yamamoto argued that physicians had obligations transcending military allegiance, a position that earned him both respect and suspicion among his peers. In 1943, Yamamoto was transferred to Guam, which Japanese forces had captured in December 1941, just days after Pearl Harbor. His assignment was to establish and command a military hospital capable of treating wounded soldiers being evacuated from battles across the Central Pacific. Guam's strategic location made it a crucial logistics hub, and its hospital facilities became essential for managing the increasing flow of casualties as American forces began their island-hopping campaign toward Japan. Yamamoto worked under impossible conditions. Medical supplies were chronically inadequate as American submarines strangled Japanese supply lines. He performed surgeries without proper anesthesia, treated infections without sufficient antibiotics, and watched soldiers die from wounds that would have been survivable with adequate resources. Yet he maintained strict professional standards, training his nurses and orderlies in proper sterile technique, keeping meticulous patient records, and insisting on the highest quality care possible given their limitations. The doctor who would change Yamamoto's life forever had taken a very different path to that fateful meeting in Guam. Major William Harrison Fletcher was born on July 19, 1908, in Portland, Oregon, into a family of physicians. His father, Dr. Robert Fletcher, ran a successful general practice, and his grandfather had been a Civil War surgeon who served with Union forces at Gettysburg. Medicine was the family profession, and young William grew up expecting to follow that tradition.
At Hopkins, Fletcher studied under some of the era's most distinguished physicians and developed particular expertise in tropical medicine and infectious diseases, fields that fascinated him with their combination of detective work and therapeutic challenge. Fletcher graduated from Hopkins in 1933, completed his residency at Massachusetts General Hospital, and by 1936 had established himself as a rising star in academic medicine. He published papers on malaria treatment, lectured on parasitic diseases, and seemed destined for a distinguished career in university medicine. But the outbreak of war in Europe, and later America's entry into the conflict, diverted his trajectory entirely. In January 1942, just weeks after Pearl Harbor, Fletcher received his commission as a captain in the Army Medical Corps. His expertise in tropical diseases made him particularly valuable as American forces prepared for campaigns in the Pacific, where malaria, dengue fever, and other tropical illnesses posed threats equal to enemy bullets. He was assigned to the Pacific Theater and spent 1942 and 1943 establishing medical facilities, training corpsmen in tropical disease prevention, and treating the flood of wounded from battles at Guadalcanal, New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands. Fletcher distinguished himself not just through medical skill, but through an unusual empathy and respect for all patients, regardless of nationality. When captured Japanese soldiers were brought to his hospital, often terrified and expecting execution, Fletcher treated them with the same professional care he gave American troops. He learned basic Japanese phrases to communicate with them, respected their cultural sensitivities regarding food and personal dignity, and insisted his staff treat them as patients, not prisoners. This approach was controversial. Many American medical personnel, having witnessed Japanese atrocities and lost friends to enemy action, struggled to extend professional courtesy to enemy captives. Fletcher understood their anger, but argued that physicians had obligations transcending nationality. Medicine, he insisted, was fundamentally humanitarian. Abandoning that principle, even toward enemies, would corrupt the profession's essential purpose. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. By mid-1945, Fletcher had been promoted to major and assigned as chief medical officer for prisoner of war facilities being established across the Pacific to handle the anticipated flood of Japanese captives as Allied forces closed in on Japan's home islands. His assignment included responsibility for medical care at camps on Guam, Saipan, and Tinian, islands recently captured from Japan at tremendous cost in American lives. The recapture of Guam in July and August 1944 had been particularly brutal. American forces suffered over 7,000 casualties, taking the island from approximately 18,000 Japanese defenders who fought with suicidal determination. When the island finally fell, fewer than 1,500 Japanese soldiers survived to be taken prisoner. The rest died in combat or committed suicide rather than face the perceived dishonor of capture. Among the survivors was Dr. Takeshi Yamamoto. His hospital had been destroyed during the American invasion, buried under naval bombardment and airstrikes that reduced most of Guam's Japanese military facilities to rubble. Yamamoto had continued operating throughout the battle, performing surgeries in underground bunkers while explosions shook the earth above. When American forces finally overran his position on August 8, 1944, Yamamoto had been in the middle of an amputation, trying to save a young soldier's life with primitive tools and no anesthesia. The American Marines who captured him found Yamamoto still in his blood-stained surgical coat, standing over his patient with a bone saw in his hand.
For a tense moment, weapons were raised, fingers on triggers. Then a Marine corpsman recognized the medical setup, saw the desperate surgery in progress, and called out to his sergeant. The Marines lowered their weapons. The corpsman approached carefully, saw what Yamamoto was attempting, and without speaking, helped him complete the amputation. That moment of professional recognition saved both Yamamoto's life and his patient's. Yamamoto was taken to a temporary prisoner holding area where Japanese captives were being processed. He expected execution or, at minimum, brutal treatment. The propaganda had been explicit. Americans were barbarians who would torture prisoners, desecrate bodies, and show no mercy. But what Yamamoto experienced was different. He was given water, food, basic medical attention for his own wounds, and most surprisingly, his medical credentials were noted and respected. Within days, Yamamoto and other Japanese medical personnel were separated from regular prisoners and moved to a different section of the camp. There, they met Major William Fletcher, who had arrived on Guam in September 1944 to establish proper medical facilities for both American troops and the growing prisoner population. Fletcher's first meeting with Yamamoto occurred on September 12, 1944, in a tent that served as the camp's medical headquarters. Yamamoto was brought in expecting interrogation or worse. Instead, Fletcher stood, extended his hand in greeting, and spoke in careful, accented Japanese. "Dr. Yamamoto, I am Major Fletcher. I understand you are a surgeon.
I would like to discuss how we can work together to care for patients." Yamamoto stood frozen, unable to process what he was hearing. Work together? Care for patients? This was not interrogation. This was a professional consultation between colleagues. Fletcher, seeing Yamamoto's confusion, gestured to a chair and continued speaking, mixing English and Japanese. "We have many wounded prisoners who need care. You know their language, their culture. You can help them better than my American doctors can. I am asking if you will work with us as a physician." The proposition was extraordinary. Fletcher was offering not forced labor, but professional collaboration. He was acknowledging Yamamoto as a fellow physician, not merely as an enemy prisoner. The implications overwhelmed Yamamoto. Everything he had been taught about American brutality contradicted this moment. Yet here was an American officer in a position of absolute power, extending professional respect and requesting cooperation rather than demanding submission. Yamamoto accepted. He had little choice, but more importantly, he recognized in Fletcher a kindred spirit, another physician who believed medicine transcended politics and nationality. That acceptance began a collaboration that would transform both men and establish a model for prisoner treatment that challenged every assumption about how enemies should be managed. Fletcher's approach to managing Japanese medical prisoners was based on a simple but revolutionary principle: treat them as colleagues, not captives. He gave Yamamoto and other Japanese doctors access to medical supplies, allowed them to care for Japanese prisoners under American supervision, and included them in discussions about patient treatment. He arranged for medical journals to be shared, facilitated discussions about complex cases, and created an environment where professional expertise mattered more than nationality. He documented improved patient outcomes, demonstrated reduced tensions in the camp, and argued that respecting professional medical ethics strengthened rather than weakened American authority. The results spoke for themselves. Mortality rates among Japanese prisoners dropped dramatically when their own doctors provided care. Cultural barriers that had complicated treatment dissolved when Japanese physicians could explain procedures in their patients' language. Perhaps most surprisingly, Japanese medical prisoners became sources of intelligence, voluntarily sharing information about Japanese military medical practices, disease outbreaks, and conditions on other islands when they were treated with professional respect rather than interrogated as enemies. Yamamoto found himself in an impossible position. He was still a prisoner, still under guard, still technically an enemy combatant. Yet he was practicing medicine again, saving lives, engaging in professional discussions with colleagues who happened to be American. The cognitive dissonance was profound. How could these be the same Americans the propaganda had described as monsters? How could this respectful treatment align with the barbarism he had been told to expect? The answer revealed itself gradually through daily interactions. Fletcher treated Yamamoto not as a symbol of Japanese militarism, but as an individual physician with skills and knowledge valuable for humanitarian purposes. Other American medical officers followed Fletcher's example, learning Japanese medical terminology, discussing case studies, seeking advice on tropical diseases endemic to Asia. Barriers that had seemed insurmountable began to dissolve in the mundane routine of medical practice. By early 1945, the collaboration had evolved beyond practical necessity into something resembling genuine professional collegiality. Yamamoto taught American doctors Japanese surgical techniques that worked well with limited resources. American physicians shared knowledge about new antibiotics and treatment protocols that Yamamoto had never encountered due to Japan's wartime isolation. Medical knowledge flowed both directions, enriching both parties. The war's end in August 1945 brought new complexity to these relationships. Japan's surrender meant that prisoners like Yamamoto would eventually be repatriated, but the timeline and conditions remained uncertain. More immediately, it brought a massive influx of new Japanese prisoners, including military personnel from Guam's original garrison who had hidden in the jungle for over a year, surviving through desperation and refusing to accept defeat. These newly captured prisoners arrived traumatized, malnourished, and still gripped by propaganda's lies about American brutality. Many attempted suicide rather than face capture. Others fought their own captivity with violent resistance. It was Yamamoto and the other Japanese medical prisoners who became essential bridges, convincing new arrivals that surrender did not mean death, that medical treatment would be provided, that their dignity would be respected. One case illustrated the transformation particularly powerfully. In September 1945, a group of Japanese soldiers who had been hiding in Guam's jungles was finally captured. Among them was a young lieutenant, barely 20 years old, who had been wounded during the original invasion and had survived more than a year in the jungle with an infected leg wound. By the time of his capture, the infection had progressed to life-threatening sepsis. He was delirious, convinced he was about to be tortured and killed. Fletcher examined the young officer and determined immediate amputation was necessary to save his life. But the lieutenant fought violently, requiring restraint. No amount of explanation in English could reach him through his terror and fever. Fletcher called for Yamamoto. Yamamoto sat beside the young lieutenant's bed and spoke softly in Japanese, explaining who he was, that he was a Japanese doctor, that the Americans intended to save his life, not take it.
He described the surgery that was necessary, acknowledged the lieutenant's fear, and gave his word as a fellow Japanese officer that he would be treated with dignity and respect. Slowly, the lieutenant calmed. He consented to the surgery. Fletcher and Yamamoto performed the amputation together, an American and a Japanese surgeon working side by side to save an enemy soldier's life. The surgery succeeded. The young lieutenant survived, and as he recovered over the following weeks, Yamamoto visited him daily, explaining what was happening, helping him understand that his captors intended no harm. The transformation was visible. Terror gave way to confusion, then to cautious acceptance, and finally to something approaching gratitude. This scene repeated itself hundreds of times across the Pacific in the war's final months and its immediate aftermath. Japanese medical prisoners, treated as colleagues rather than enemies, became the crucial link, helping thousands of terrified Japanese captives understand they were not facing execution but humane treatment according to international law. The respect Fletcher and other medical officers showed to enemy physicians generated trust that no amount of official proclamations could have achieved. The mathematics of this transformation were not calculated in military victories or strategic advantages, but in the quiet accumulation of moments where professional respect overcame national hatred. Each interaction between American and Japanese physicians chipped away at the propaganda that had painted enemies as monsters. Each successful surgery performed by mixed teams demonstrated that medical excellence knew no borders. Each life saved through collaboration proved that the Hippocratic Oath could survive even the most brutal war. Dr. Yamamoto's journal, which he kept throughout his captivity, documented this evolution in entries that moved from despair to confusion to cautious hope. In September 1944, shortly after his capture, he wrote in careful Japanese characters, "I am alive when I expected death. They call me doctor, not prisoner. I do not understand this place." By December 1944, his tone had shifted. "Today, I assisted Major Fletcher in a complex abdominal surgery on an American soldier. He asked my opinion on the approach. My opinion, as if I were his colleague, not his captive." By March 1945, Yamamoto's entries reflected genuine bewilderment at the cognitive dissonance between his experience and his expectations. How can these be the barbarians we were told about? They share their medical journals with me. They ask about Japanese surgical techniques with genuine curiosity, not interrogation. Lieutenant Morrison brought me coffee this morning and asked about my family in Japan. He has a son my age. We talked about medicine and hopes for peace. This war has made enemies of men who should have been friends.
The relationship between Fletcher and Yamamoto deepened beyond professional collaboration into something approaching genuine friendship, though both men were careful never to name it as such. The war was not yet over. They remained technically enemies, separated by an unbridgeable gulf of nationality and conflict. Yet they found common ground in their shared dedication to medicine, their similar philosophies about patient care, and their mutual recognition that war had forced them into roles neither had sought. Fletcher learned about Yamamoto's sister, who had died of tuberculosis, the loss that had driven him to medicine. Yamamoto learned about Fletcher's father and grandfather, both physicians, and the family legacy of healing that Fletcher carried. They discussed medical ethics, debated treatment approaches, and found themselves agreeing far more often than they disagreed. National boundaries seemed increasingly arbitrary when measured against their shared commitment to preserving life.
Other American medical officers began following Fletcher's example. Captain James Morrison, a young surgeon from Chicago, had initially resisted the idea of working with Japanese doctors. He had lost friends at Guadalcanal and carried deep anger toward anything Japanese. But working alongside Dr. Kenji Tanaka, a thoracic surgeon from Osaka who had been captured on Saipan, gradually eroded that anger. Morrison and Tanaka were forced to collaborate on a complex case in January 1945, an American sailor who had suffered a traumatic chest injury during an accident on a transport ship. The surgery required techniques both men possessed, but neither could execute alone. Morrison handled the initial incision and exposure, while Tanaka, whose hands were steadier and more experienced with thoracic procedures, performed the delicate repair of damaged lung tissue. They worked in silence at first, communicating through gesture and minimal translated instruction. But as the surgery progressed and they fell into synchronized rhythm, something shifted. After the surgery succeeded and the sailor was stabilized, Morrison extended his hand to Tanaka in the recovery area. "That was excellent work, doctor. Thank you." Tanaka accepted the handshake, bowed slightly, and replied in halting English, "Thank you also. Together we saved life. That is purpose." Morrison later wrote to his wife that he had hated the Japanese doctor at the surgery's start and respected him by its end. War makes enemies of people who have no reason to hate each other, except that politicians and generals tell them to. I wonder how many of the men I fought against were just doctors and teachers and fathers who wanted to go home. These transformations were not universal. Some American medical personnel never accepted the concept of treating enemy doctors as colleagues. Some Japanese medical prisoners remained deeply suspicious of American intentions, convinced that the respectful treatment was temporary or deceptive. Cultural barriers and language difficulties created persistent challenges. The enormous gulf between Japanese and American cultural norms regarding hierarchy, honor, and communication style produced countless misunderstandings. But Fletcher persisted in his approach because the results were undeniable. Patient outcomes improved. Camp tensions decreased. The Japanese medical prisoners became valuable resources not just for treating their own countrymen, but for teaching American medical staff about tropical diseases, battlefield medicine with limited resources, and cultural factors affecting patient care. Knowledge flowed in both directions, enriching both American and Japanese medical understanding. One particularly striking example involved malaria treatment. Malaria had ravaged American forces throughout the Pacific Campaign, sometimes causing more casualties than combat. Dr. Hiroshi Nakamura, a specialist in tropical medicine who had served in the Philippines and Dutch East Indies, possessed extensive experience treating malaria strains endemic to Southeast Asia. When several American soldiers contracted a particularly virulent strain that resisted standard quinine treatment, Fletcher consulted Nakamura.
Nakamura explained a treatment protocol using a combination of herbal supplements and altered dosing schedules that Japanese physicians had developed through years of colonial medical practice in tropical regions. American doctors were skeptical. The approach contradicted standard medical texts, but Fletcher authorized a trial. The treatment worked remarkably well, reducing fever and parasite loads faster than conventional approaches. The American medical staff documented the protocol, incorporated it into treatment guidelines, and credited Nakamoto's contribution in their reports. For Nakamura, the experience was profoundly disorienting. He had expected captivity to be humiliating and brutal. Instead, his professional knowledge was not only respected, but formally credited and disseminated. His techniques would save American lives, the lives of the enemy he had been fighting.
Yet he felt satisfaction rather than conflict. He was a physician first, and physicians saved lives regardless of nationality. As spring turned to summer in 1945 and the war ground toward its terrible conclusion, the medical collaboration on Guam had developed into a functioning, integrated system. American and Japanese doctors conducted joint rounds, discussed complex cases in mixed-language conversations, supplemented by medical diagrams and shared terminology, and increasingly thought of themselves as colleagues rather than captors and captives. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 hit the Japanese medical prisoners with devastating psychological impact. Many had families in Japanese cities. Communication had been impossible during their captivity, and they had no way of knowing if their loved ones had survived. Yamamoto had family in Yokohama. Tanaka's wife and children lived in Osaka. Nakamura's parents and siblings were in Tokyo. The uncertainty was agonizing. Fletcher recognized the humanitarian crisis unfolding among his Japanese colleagues. He worked through military channels to obtain whatever information was available about conditions in Japanese cities, shared casualty estimates as honestly as possible, and provided what comfort he could to men devastated by news of their homeland's destruction. He did not celebrate Japan's surrender when it came on August 15th. Instead, he found Yamamoto sitting alone outside the hospital tent, staring toward the western horizon where Japan lay thousands of miles distant. Fletcher sat beside him in silence for several minutes. Finally, he spoke quietly. "I am sorry for your country's suffering. This war has brought too much death." Yamamoto turned to look at Fletcher, his face drawn with grief and exhaustion. "My sister died because we lacked medicine. Now my country burns because we could not stop making war. All this death, for what purpose?" Fletcher had no answer. He simply sat with his colleague through the long Pacific evening as the war finally ended. The surrender created immediate practical challenges. What would happen to the Japanese medical prisoners? Repatriation would take months, possibly years. The massive logistical challenge of returning millions of Japanese military personnel and civilians to their devastated homeland required time and resources the victorious Allies did not immediately possess. In the interim, the Japanese doctors remained in custody, though the nature of that custody had become increasingly ambiguous. Fletcher proposed something radical. Rather than confining Japanese medical prisoners to standard POW camps awaiting repatriation, he suggested they be employed in medical facilities treating both American troops and Japanese prisoners across the Pacific. The proposal faced immediate resistance from military commanders who viewed any expanded role for enemy prisoners as security risks. But Fletcher argued that medical personnel posed minimal security threats, that their skills were desperately needed given the shortage of medical staff relative to the enormous patient population across the Pacific, and that employing them productively was more humane than forcing them to sit idle in camps for months.
After weeks of bureaucratic battles, Fletcher received conditional approval for a pilot program. Selected Japanese medical prisoners would be assigned to various American military hospitals across the Pacific, working under supervision but with substantial professional autonomy. Security protocols would be maintained, but these men would function as medical staff, not prisoners. The program would be monitored carefully and terminated immediately if any security concerns emerged. Yamamoto was among the first selected for the expanded program. In October 1945, he was transferred from the Guam POW camp to the main American Naval Hospital on Guam, where he would work as a consulting surgeon. The change was subtle but profound. He no longer lived behind barbed wire. He had his own room and staff quarters.
He wore a white medical coat without guards constantly present. He attended medical staff meetings, participated in case discussions, and performed surgeries alongside American doctors who increasingly forgot he was technically still a prisoner. The psychological impact of this transition was complicated. Yamamoto experienced guilt that he was living relatively comfortably while millions of his countrymen faced starvation and devastation in occupied Japan. He felt conflicted about his growing friendships with American colleagues while Japanese soldiers remained in harsh POW camps. He questioned whether his cooperation constituted collaboration or betrayal. These tensions produced sleepless nights and deep introspection that he documented in his journal. Yet he also recognized that he was practicing medicine at a higher level than had been possible during the war. He had access to modern antibiotics, proper surgical equipment, adequate supplies. He was learning new techniques from skilled American surgeons. He was saving lives. His work had meaning and purpose. Was this betrayal or simply a physician doing what physicians are meant to do regardless of political circumstances? Dr. Tanaka faced similar conflicts when he was assigned to a field hospital on Okinawa in November 1945. Okinawa had been the site of the war's bloodiest battle in the Pacific, with over 100,000 Japanese soldiers and potentially twice that many Okinawan civilians killed during 3 months of fighting earlier that year. The island was devastated, its population traumatized and desperate. American military government was struggling to provide basic services, including medical care for the surviving civilian population. Tanaka found himself treating Okinawan civilians, many of whom viewed him with deep suspicion. He was Japanese military, representatives of the forces that had conscripted Okinawan men, commandeered resources, and ultimately brought catastrophic destruction to their island. Yet, he was also a doctor, and Okinawans were dying from malnutrition, disease, and untreated wounds. Tanaka worked 18-hour days in makeshift clinics, treating patients who sometimes cursed him even as he saved their lives. An American medical officer, Captain David Chen, himself a Chinese-American who had faced prejudice and suspicion during the war years, recognized Tanaka's struggle. Chen spoke to him one evening after a particularly difficult day. "They hate what you represent, but they need what you offer. That is the burden of being useful. You cannot control how they feel. You can only control the quality of care you provide. Give them your best work. That is how you make amends." Tanaka absorbed this advice. He stopped trying to explain or justify his presence and simply focused on being the best physician he could be. Gradually, Okinawan patients began to accept him. They saw his dedication, his skill, his willingness to work exhausting hours for their benefit. The hatred did not disappear, but it was joined by grudging respect, then cautious trust, and finally, in some cases, genuine gratitude. Similar patterns emerged across the Pacific wherever Japanese medical prisoners were employed in medical facilities. Initial resistance gave way to practical cooperation, which evolved into professional respect. American medical staff discovered that their Japanese colleagues possessed valuable knowledge and skills. Japanese doctors found that they could practice medicine at levels impossible during wartime scarcity.
Patients, whether American soldiers, Japanese prisoners, or Pacific Island civilians, benefited from expanded medical capacity and culturally sensitive care. The program expanded through late 1945 and into 1946. By early 1946, over 200 Japanese medical prisoners were working in various medical facilities across the Pacific. Security concerns that had initially worried military commanders proved largely unfounded. The Japanese doctors were carefully monitored, but incidents were remarkably rare. These were men whose lives had been defined by their professional commitments to healing.
Given the opportunity to practice medicine rather than languish in confinement, they seized it gratefully. Fletcher documented the program's outcomes meticulously, compiling statistics on patient outcomes, security incidents, and professional development. He conducted surveys among American medical staff, Japanese medical prisoners, and patients. The data overwhelmingly supported the program's continuation and expansion. Patient mortality rates in facilities employing Japanese doctors were lower than in facilities without them. Security incidents were minimal. American medical staff reported positive professional relationships with Japanese colleagues. Most strikingly, Japanese medical prisoners reported dramatically better psychological well-being when engaged in meaningful medical work compared to those confined in standard POW camps awaiting repatriation. Fletcher's reports generated interest among senior military medical officers who recognized the program's potential implications. The United States was going to occupy Japan for years. Rebuilding Japanese medical infrastructure would be essential for preventing disease outbreaks that could affect American occupation forces. Japanese medical professionals who had worked cooperatively with American counterparts could become valuable partners in that reconstruction effort. But the program's significance extended beyond practical utility. It represented a profound philosophical statement about how former enemies could transition toward peace. The war had been brutal, characterized by atrocities and hatred that seemed to preclude any rapid reconciliation. Yet here were American and Japanese physicians working together mere months after the war's end. Not just coexisting, but genuinely collaborating towards shared humanitarian goals. In March 1946, Fletcher received orders transferring him to Japan as part of the Occupation Medical Administration. His assignment was to help rebuild Japanese medical infrastructure and establish cooperative relationships with Japanese medical institutions. It was recognition that his approach to managing Japanese medical prisoners had succeeded beyond expectations, and that his skills would be valuable in occupied Japan. Before departing Guam, Fletcher organized a small ceremony to recognize the Japanese doctors who had worked in the island's medical facilities. It was an unusual event, acknowledging enemy prisoners for their contributions. Fletcher gave a brief speech in English, which Yamamoto translated into Japanese. He thanked the Japanese doctors for their professionalism, their dedication to patient care, and their willingness to work cooperatively despite difficult circumstances. He presented each doctor with a letter documenting their service, which he hoped might help them as they eventually returned to Japan and resumed their careers. Yamamoto responded on behalf of the Japanese doctors. His voice was steady but emotional. Major Fletcher has taught us that medicine transcends nationality. We were enemies who became colleagues. We were prisoners who were treated with dignity. We were expected to be monsters and instead were given the opportunity to be healers. This experience has changed us. We will carry the memory of American doctors who treated us as respected colleagues, not hated enemies, for the rest of our lives. We hope to rebuild Japan as a nation that values peace and cooperation. That rebuilding must begin with individual relationships like those we have formed here. There were no dry eyes among the Japanese doctors. Several American medical officers were equally moved. The ceremony was brief, almost awkward in its emotional intensity, but it marked something important. Enemies were transforming into colleagues. Hatred was yielding to respect, and war's bitter divisions were beginning to heal through the simple act of working together towards shared humanitarian goals. When Fletcher departed for Japan in April 1946, Yamamoto remained on Guam, still awaiting repatriation.
They shook hands at the airfield, two physicians who had become friends despite being separated by war and nationality. Fletcher promised to look for Yamamoto when he reached Japan.
Yamamoto promised to find Fletcher if he ever returned to medical practice in Tokyo. Both men knew the promises might be impossible to keep, given the chaos of post-war Japan, but the sentiment mattered more than the likelihood. Yamamoto finally returned to Japan in July 1946, more than a year after the war's end. The repatriation ship carrying hundreds of former prisoners approached Yokohama harbor on a gray morning, and Yamamoto stood on deck watching the coastline emerge through morning mist. This was home, yet it felt foreign. The Japan he had left in 1938 no longer existed. That nation had been confident, militaristic, convinced of its divine destiny. The Japan he was returning to had been defeated, occupied, devastated by fire and atomic weapons. The harbor was crowded with American ships, evidence of the occupation that would govern Japan for years to come. As the repatriation vessel docked, Yamamoto could see the destroyed industrial facilities, the empty spaces where buildings had stood, the profound transformation war had inflicted on his homeland. He carried his medical bag, the torn surgical textbook he had salvaged from Guam's rubble, and the letter Fletcher had given him documenting his service in American medical facilities. Processing through repatriation centers took days. Japanese returnees were interrogated about their wartime activities, screened for war crimes involvement, and evaluated for their potential roles in occupied Japan. Yamamoto's case was unusual. His documented cooperation with American medical authorities could be viewed as collaboration or pragmatic humanitarianism depending on perspective. Some interrogators were suspicious. Others were grateful he had helped bridge the cultural divide between occupiers and occupied. What saved Yamamoto from deeper scrutiny was a surprising intervention. Major William Fletcher, now working in Tokyo as part of the Occupation Medical Administration, learned through military channels that Yamamoto had been repatriated to Yokohama. Fletcher immediately traveled to the repatriation center and vouched for Yamamoto's character and professional conduct. The American major's testimony carried weight with occupation authorities, and Yamamoto was cleared quickly with recommendations that he be considered for employment in rebuilding Japanese medical infrastructure. Their reunion at the repatriation center was emotional. Two men who had worked together as colleagues in the strange environment of wartime captivity now met in occupied Japan, their roles reversed yet still somehow equal. Fletcher embraced Yamamoto, an unusual gesture that violated both military protocol and Japanese cultural norms regarding physical contact. Yamamoto returned the embrace, too overwhelmed to care about propriety. Fletcher explained his new assignment. He was working with the occupation authorities to rebuild Japanese hospitals, reestablish medical schools, and create public health systems to prevent disease outbreaks in the devastated nation. The work was enormous, complicated by destroyed infrastructure, severe shortages of everything from medicines to basic supplies, and the psychological trauma affecting the entire Japanese population. He needed Japanese medical professionals who could work cooperatively with American authorities while maintaining credibility with Japanese colleagues and patients. He wanted Yamamoto to join his team. The position would involve working as a liaison between American occupation medical authorities and Japanese medical institutions. Yamamoto would help identify Japanese doctors qualified for leadership roles, facilitate communication between American and Japanese medical staff, and assist in developing medical protocols appropriate for Japan's current conditions. It was a position requiring trust from both sides, exactly the role Yamamoto's unique experience had prepared him for.
Some Japanese viewed anyone cooperating with occupation authorities as collaborators betraying the nation. Others recognized that practical cooperation was necessary for Japan's recovery. Yamamoto focused on the work's humanitarian purpose. Japanese civilians were suffering. Medical care was desperately inadequate. If he could help rebuild medical systems that would save Japanese lives, the political complications were secondary. His first assignment involved visiting Tokyo hospitals to assess their condition and capabilities. What he found was devastating. Tokyo had been subjected to massive firebombing campaigns that destroyed much of the city. Hospitals that had survived physically were operating without adequate supplies, staff, or equipment. Doctors were treating patients with improvised tools and salvaged medicines.
Nurses worked without proper protective equipment. Entire wards lacked basic necessities like clean water and functioning electricity. At Tokyo Imperial University Hospital, where Yamamoto had trained before the war, he encountered former professors and colleagues working under conditions that would have been unthinkable in 1936. Dr. Shiro Ishikawa, who had been Yamamoto's surgical instructor, was performing operations with instruments sterilized over open flames because the hospital's autoclave had been destroyed and not replaced. Medications were rationed so strictly that patients received fractions of therapeutic doses. Bandages were washed and reused until they disintegrated. Ishikawa recognized Yamamoto immediately, despite the years and hardship. They met in the hospital's damaged surgical suite, where Ishikawa was preparing for an appendectomy on a malnourished teenager. The greeting was formal, constrained by Japanese hierarchical norms, but Ishikawa's eyes conveyed both recognition and question. What had Yamamoto been doing since the war? How had he survived captivity? Yamamoto explained carefully, watching Ishikawa's reaction. He described his capture on Guam, his expectation of execution, his surprise at being treated as a medical colleague rather than an enemy prisoner. He described working with American doctors, the respect he had been shown, the professional collaboration that had developed. He explained his current role working with occupation medical authorities to rebuild Japanese healthcare. Ishikawa listened silently, his face unreadable. When Yamamoto finished, there was a long pause. Then Ishikawa spoke quietly. "You were fortunate. Many did not survive captivity. Those who did often faced terrible treatment. That you were treated with respect speaks well of the individual Americans you encountered. Now you're here to help us. We need help desperately. Politics matter less than saving lives. Can you get us supplies, medicines, equipment?" The question cut through any philosophical debate about collaboration or resistance. Japanese patients were dying from treatable conditions because hospitals lacked basic resources. If Yamamoto could facilitate access to American occupation supplies, thousands of lives could be saved. The moral calculation was straightforward. He promised Ishikawa he would do everything possible to direct resources to Tokyo Imperial University Hospital. Over the following weeks, Yamamoto visited dozens of hospitals across Tokyo and surrounding regions. The pattern repeated everywhere. Dedicated Japanese medical professionals working under impossible conditions, treating patients with inadequate resources, desperate for help regardless of its source. Yamamoto compiled detailed reports documenting needs, prioritizing facilities based on patient load and current capabilities, and recommending resource allocation strategies. Fletcher reviewed these reports and used them to guide American occupation medical policy. Supplies began flowing to Japanese hospitals based on Yamamoto's recommendations. Medicines that had been unavailable for years started appearing in hospital pharmacies. Surgical equipment was distributed. Water purification systems were installed. The improvements were incremental but meaningful.
Mortality rates began declining. Doctors could treat patients more effectively. Hope started replacing despair. But the work went beyond physical resources. Fletcher recognized that rebuilding Japanese medical infrastructure required restoring Japanese medical professionals' confidence and autonomy. The occupation could not simply impose American medical practices on Japan. Successful reconstruction required integrating American resources and knowledge with Japanese medical expertise and cultural understanding. That required relationships built on mutual respect, exactly the model Fletcher and Yamamoto had developed on Guam. Fletcher organized a series of medical conferences, bringing together American military medical officers and Japanese civilian physicians. These gatherings were initially awkward, marked by language barriers, cultural misunderstandings, and lingering wartime resentments. Japanese doctors were suspicious of American intentions. American medical officers struggled to understand Japanese medical traditions and cultural norms affecting patient care.
Yamamoto served as bridge and translator, not just linguistically, but culturally. He explained to American doctors why Japanese patients responded differently to certain treatments, due to cultural factors affecting diet, lifestyle, and attitudes toward illness. He explained to Japanese doctors why American medical protocols emphasized certain procedures and standards. He facilitated discussions that might otherwise have collapsed into mutual incomprehension. Dr. Kenji Tanaka arrived in Tokyo in August 1946, repatriated from Okinawa where he had been working in American medical facilities. Fletcher immediately recruited him to join Yamamoto's liaison team. Tanaka brought different expertise, particularly regarding public health challenges in rural areas where medical infrastructure had always been limited and was now essentially non-existent. Together, Yamamoto and Tanaka became the core of a growing group of Japanese physicians working to rebuild their nation's medical systems while cooperating with occupation authorities. Their work faced opposition from multiple directions. Some Japanese nationalists viewed them as collaborators serving the occupying power. Anonymous letters accused them of betraying Japan's honor by working with the enemy. Several received threats. The criticism was painful, particularly because Yamamoto and Tanaka genuinely loved their country and saw their work as patriotic service to suffering Japanese people. But they persisted, believing that ideological purity mattered less than practical results. They also faced skepticism from some American occupation officials, who questioned whether Japanese medical professionals could be trusted with significant responsibilities. These officials preferred direct American management of all aspects of occupied Japan, viewing Japanese cooperation as convenient but ultimately subordinate to American authority. Fletcher fought persistent bureaucratic battles, arguing that sustainable reconstruction required empowering Japanese professionals, not permanently subordinating them. The breakthrough came in October 1946 when a cholera outbreak threatened Tokyo. Cholera, spread through contaminated water, could kill rapidly and spread explosively in conditions of poor sanitation and overcrowding that characterized post-war Tokyo. American occupation authorities recognized the outbreak could become catastrophic if not contained quickly. They needed Japanese medical professionals who understood local conditions, could communicate with Japanese civilians, and could implement public health measures effectively. Fletcher gave Yamamoto and Tanaka lead responsibility for coordinating the cholera response. They worked 18-hour days, organizing treatment facilities, training personnel in cholera case management, implementing water sanitation measures, and conducting public education campaigns. They coordinated between American military resources and Japanese civilian medical systems, ensuring that supplies reached areas of greatest need and the treatment protocols were culturally appropriate. The campaign succeeded. The outbreak was contained within 3 weeks, with far fewer deaths than initial projections predicted.
The success demonstrated conclusively that Japanese medical professionals, given resources and authority, could manage complex public health challenges effectively. Fletcher used the cholera response as evidence in his ongoing arguments for greater Japanese autonomy in medical administration. By early 1947, the model of cooperative medical reconstruction had been established and was expanding. Japanese doctors who had served as prisoners working with American medical facilities were being recruited into leadership positions in occupied Japan's medical administration. Their unique experience bridging American and Japanese medical cultures made them invaluable. More importantly, their success was changing attitudes on both sides. American occupation officials who had been skeptical about Japanese capabilities saw evidence that cooperation produced better outcomes than imposed control. Japanese medical professionals who had resented occupation saw that working with Americans could provide resources and support that independent action could not.
Patients, whether in Tokyo hospitals or rural clinics, benefited from improved care made possible by this collaboration. Dr. Hiroshi Nakamura, the tropical medicine specialist who had taught American doctors about malaria treatment on Guam, was recruited to help establish a national disease surveillance system in Japan. His expertise was perfectly suited for the task. He designed protocols for detecting and responding to infectious disease outbreaks before they became epidemics. He trained local health workers across Japan in disease recognition and reporting. He created communication systems linking rural clinics to urban hospitals to central health authorities. The surveillance system Nakamura designed became a model that influenced public health systems worldwide in subsequent decades. It demonstrated how systematic disease monitoring could prevent outbreaks from becoming disasters. More immediately, it saved countless Japanese lives during the difficult post-war years when malnutrition and poor sanitation made populations vulnerable to infectious diseases. By mid-1947, Fletcher had been promoted to lieutenant colonel and given expanded responsibility for medical aspects of the occupation across all of Japan. He used this authority to accelerate the transition from American control to Japanese autonomy in medical administration. He appointed Yamamoto as his deputy director, giving him formal authority over Japanese medical personnel working with occupation authorities. He appointed Tanaka to direct rural health programs. He placed Nakamura in charge of disease surveillance and epidemic response. These appointments were controversial. Some American officers protested that Fletcher was giving too much authority to former enemy personnel too quickly. But Fletcher's argument was compelling. The occupation would not last forever. When Americans eventually left Japan, Japanese medical systems needed to be sustainable and self-sufficient. That required training Japanese leaders and giving them real responsibility now, not maintaining American control indefinitely. Fletcher also recognized something deeper. The respect he had shown to Japanese medical prisoners during and immediately after the war had generated trust and loyalty that could not be commanded. Yamamoto, Tanaka, Nakamura, and others worked with extraordinary dedication not because they were forced to, but because they genuinely believed in the collaborative model Fletcher had demonstrated. They saw him as a mentor and colleague, not an occupying authority. That relationship produced far better results than any system based on coercion could have achieved. The personal relationships deepened as well. Fletcher was invited to Yamamoto's home in Tokyo, meeting his wife Akiko and his children who had survived the war years, despite hardship and uncertainty. The dinner was formal, constrained by cultural protocols, but genuine warmth emerged as the evening progressed. Akiko thanked Fletcher for protecting her husband during captivity. Fletcher demurred, saying Yamamoto's own professionalism and character had earned respect, not anything Fletcher had done. Yamamoto's teenage son, Takeshi, named after his father, spoke English learned in post-war schools and peppered Fletcher with questions about America, about medical practice, about whether he thought Japanese and Americans could truly become friends after such a terrible war. Fletcher answered thoughtfully. He said the challenges are still great, but the prospects for friendship and cooperation are enormously hopeful.
War created hatred, but individuals could choose whether to sustain that hatred or move beyond it. He had chosen to see Japanese prisoners as fellow physicians first and enemies second. That choice had revealed shared humanity that transcended national conflict. The young Takeshi absorbed this answer, then made a statement that summarized the transformation occurring across Japan. My father left Japan believing Americans were barbarians. He returned believing Americans could be colleagues and friends. I will grow up in a Japan that must learn to live in peace with former enemies. Your friendship with my father shows that such a future is possible. Fletcher left that dinner deeply moved. The conversation had crystallized what his work truly meant. He was not just rebuilding hospitals or training medical personnel. He was helping create the foundation for lasting peace by demonstrating that former enemies could work together with mutual respect. The relationships he had built with Japanese medical professionals during and after the war were not just professionally productive. They were proof that reconciliation was possible even after the most bitter conflict. By 1948, the transition was accelerating. Japanese medical schools had reopened with American support, but Japanese administration. Hospitals were being rebuilt with American resources, but Japanese design, reflecting Japanese medical practices and cultural norms. The medical surveillance systems were operating under Japanese direction with American consultation rather than control. The occupation's medical mission was evolving from direct management to advisory support, exactly as Fletcher had envisioned. In September 1948, Fletcher received orders returning him to the United States. His tour in Japan was ending. The news produced mixed emotions. He was ready to return home to his family in Oregon, whom he had seen only briefly during leaves over the past 6 years. But leaving Japan meant leaving work he found deeply meaningful and colleagues he genuinely respected. A farewell ceremony was organized at Tokyo Imperial University Hospital. Japanese medical professionals from across the country attended, many traveling significant distances despite continued transportation difficulties. Yamamoto gave the primary speech, speaking in Japanese that was translated into English for the American officers present. He described Fletcher's arrival on Guam in 1944, his willingness to treat enemy doctors as colleagues rather than prisoners, his insistence on professional respect regardless of nationality. He recounted Fletcher's work rebuilding Japanese medical infrastructure, his advocacy for Japanese autonomy, his mentorship of Japanese medical leaders. He concluded with words that brought tears to many listeners. Major Fletcher, now Lieutenant Colonel Fletcher, came to us as a conqueror, but acted as a colleague and friend. He taught us that medicine transcends politics, that professional respect survives even war's hatred, that former enemies can become trusted partners. Because of his example, Japanese and American doctors work together today, not through coercion, but through genuine cooperation. We are better physicians because of him. Japan is healing faster because of him. When historians write about the occupation, they will focus on generals and politicians. But we who worked with him know that peace was built not just through treaties, but through individual relationships like those he created. We are grateful beyond words. Fletcher responded briefly. He thanked the Japanese medical professionals for their dedication to their patients and their country. He expressed admiration for their resilience in rebuilding after devastating loss. He said that working with Japanese doctors had been among the most meaningful experiences of his career. He concluded with a hope that the collaborative model they had developed would continue long after he departed, and would serve as an example that former enemies could build lasting peace through mutual respect and shared purpose. The ceremony ended with a gift presentation.
The author explored how his parents' vastly different wartime experiences. His father treated respectfully as a medical colleague in the Pacific, while his mother faced discrimination and imprisonment in America, shaped his understanding of how individuals could transcend or perpetuate hatred depending on their choices. The book argued that Fletcher's decision to treat Japanese doctors as colleagues represented a choice available to all individuals facing enemies. One could choose to see only national identity and maintain hatred, or one could choose to see individual humanity and create possibilities for reconciliation. The book's success, becoming required reading in many medical schools and peace studies programs, demonstrated continued relevance of the story decades after the events occurred.
As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, fewer direct participants in the wartime medical collaboration remained alive. Fletcher died in 1994, Yamamoto in 1989, Tanaka in 2003, Nakamura in 2007. But their legacy lived on through students they had taught, institutions they had built, and the example they had set. The principle that professional respect could transcend national enmity continued influencing how medical professionals approached international conflicts and humanitarian crises. During the Gulf War in 1991, American military medical facilities treating Iraqi prisoners applied lessons learned from World War II Japanese POW treatment. Iraqi medical personnel among the prisoners were identified and employed in caring for their fellow captives, creating a collaborative model that improved care and reduced tensions. American medical officers explicitly cited the World War II precedent when justifying this approach to skeptical commanders. Similar patterns emerged in subsequent conflicts. During peacekeeping operations in the Balkans in the 1990s, international medical teams deliberately sought to create collaborative relationships with local medical professionals from all sides of those conflicts. The model of respecting professional expertise regardless of political affiliation, tested in World War II and refined through subsequent decades, proved effective in reducing tensions and improving humanitarian outcomes. Medical humanitarian organizations like Doctors Without Borders incorporated principles of professional respect, transcending national and political boundaries into their operational doctrines. The organization's insistence on providing care to all parties in conflicts, treating patients based on medical need rather than political affiliation, reflected the same values that Fletcher had demonstrated treating Japanese POW doctors during World War II. The story's influence extended to broader discussions about reconciliation after conflict. Peace researchers studying how former enemies could transition to cooperation identified the medical collaboration as an important case study. They noted several factors that made it successful. First, the collaboration was based on genuine professional respect, not mere pragmatic cooperation. Second, it began during the conflict rather than only after war's end, creating relationships that could be built upon during reconstruction. Third, it involved sustained personal interactions that allowed individuals to see past stereotypes and recognize shared values. Fourth, it produced tangible benefits for both parties, demonstrating that cooperation served mutual interests rather than requiring one side to sacrifice for the other's benefit. These factors, identified through studying the Japanese-American medical collaboration, informed approaches to reconciliation in other post-conflict situations. Truth and reconciliation processes in South Africa after apartheid, peace-building efforts in Rwanda after the genocide, and reconstruction programs in Iraq and Afghanistan after American interventions all drew lessons from historical examples of successful enemy-to-colleague transformations.
Educational institutions created programs specifically designed to bring together young people from nations with histories of conflict. Medical students from Japan and the United States participated in exchange programs explicitly framed around learning from the wartime medical collaboration. Similar programs brought together students from Israel and Palestine, India and Pakistan, Greece and Turkey, always emphasizing that professional relationships and personal friendships could transcend political divisions. One such program, established in 2005 by the Pacific Medical Alliance, brought together medical students from Japan, the United States, and other Pacific nations for summer internships working in underserved communities throughout the region. Participants lived and worked together, learning not just medicine, but how to collaborate across cultural and national boundaries. The program's founding document explicitly cited Fletcher and Yamamoto's example as inspiration, noting that their wartime and post-war collaboration had created a model of international medical cooperation that continued influencing practices 6 decades later. The participants in these modern programs often reported experiences similar to what the original doctors had described. Initial discomfort and cultural misunderstandings gave way to recognition of shared professional values and common humanitarian goals. Stereotypes dissolved through personal interaction. Friendships formed across national boundaries. Participants returned to their home countries with transformed perspectives about former enemies and enhanced commitment to international cooperation. By the early 21st century, Japanese-American medical cooperation had become so routine and extensive that its wartime origins were sometimes forgotten by younger generations. Major research collaborations, student exchanges, and joint clinical programs operated continuously, with participants rarely reflecting on how remarkable such cooperation would have seemed to people who had lived through World War II. In a sense, this normalization represented the ultimate success of what Fletcher, Yamamoto, and others had begun. What had once required conscious choice to overcome hatred had become standard practice assumed by new generations who had never experienced that hatred. Yet, some deliberate effort was made to remember and honor the pioneers. Medical schools in both nations featured exhibits about the wartime elaboration. Professional medical associations gave awards named after Fletcher and Yamamoto to physicians who exemplified international cooperation and humanitarian service. Academic journals occasionally published historical articles examining the medical collaboration's origins and impact, ensuring that new generations of physicians understood the foundation upon which their international cooperation rested. In 2015, 70 years after World War II's conclusion, another major symposium was held, this time alternating between Tokyo and San Francisco over several days connected by video conference. The event brought together hundreds of Japanese and American medical professionals, few with any personal memory of the war, but all benefiting from the collaborative relationships that had emerged from it. The symposium theme was From Enemies to Partners, 70 Years of Medical Cooperation. The event featured presentations about current collaborative research projects, discussions of future opportunities, and historical reflections on the transformation that had made such cooperation possible. Descendants of the original doctors, including Yamamoto's grandson, who was now a cardiac surgeon in Osaka, and Fletcher's granddaughter, who was a public health specialist in Seattle, gave presentations about their family histories and how their career choices had been influenced by their grandparents' examples. The most moving moment came when organizers screened archival footage from the 1985 symposium, showing Fletcher and Yamamoto's reunion and Fletcher's keynote address. Watching the elderly doctors embrace, hearing Fletcher's words about choosing respect over hatred, the contemporary audience was visibly affected. Several younger physicians were seen wiping tears, struck by the emotional power of that friendship and the conscious choices that had made it possible. A panel discussion following the video screening addressed the question of what lessons remained relevant 70 years later. Panelists noted that while Japanese-American relations had been transformed beyond recognition, the world still faced conflicts where enemies needed to transition toward peace. The principles demonstrated by Fletcher and Yamamoto, that professional respect could transcend national enmity, that treating enemies as potential colleagues rather than permanent adversaries created opportunities for reconciliation, that individual choices accumulated into transformative social change remained vitally relevant. One panelist, a trauma surgeon who had worked in conflict zones in Syria and Yemen, spoke powerfully about applying these lessons in contemporary settings. Every war produces medical professionals on opposing sides who share more with each other than with the politicians and generals who started the conflict. Finding ways to recognize that shared professional commitment, to create collaboration even amid ongoing violence, can plant seeds for eventual peace. What Fletcher did in 1944 was not just historically interesting. It is a practical model for how to begin healing even before wars end. The symposium concluded with a commitment to establish an endowment funding international medical education programs, bringing together students from nations with histories of conflict. The endowment would be named the Fletcher-Yamamoto Fund for International Medical Cooperation, honoring both doctors whose friendship had demonstrated reconciliation's possibility.
Initial fundraising exceeded goals, with contributions coming from medical associations, pharmaceutical companies, individual doctors, and notably, several peace-oriented foundations recognizing the program's potential contribution to conflict resolution. The legacy of Japanese POW doctors who could not believe Americans treated them as respected colleagues thus continued evolving more than 7 decades after the events occurred. What had begun as one American medical officer's decision to apply professional ethics to enemy prisoners had grown into an international movement affecting medical practice, peace-building efforts, and thousands of individual lives. The transformation from enemies to colleagues to friends, documented in the lives of Fletcher and Yamamoto, proved replicable across time and geography, offering hope that even the deepest hatreds could be overcome through conscious choices to recognize shared humanity. The story's ultimate meaning lay not in military history or diplomatic achievement, but in the simple truth it illustrated. Individual choices matter. How we treat enemies shapes possibilities for future peace. Professional values and ethical commitments can survive even the worst circumstances. Respect generates reciprocal respect. Hatred perpetuates hatred, but so too does respect perpetuate respect. The doctors who lived this story, through their choices and their example, demonstrated that transformation from enemy to colleague to friend was possible for anyone willing to see past national identity to recognize shared humanity. Their legacy endures not in monuments or official histories, but in the countless medical collaborations occurring daily between professionals from nations that were once enemies.
Every Japanese and American doctor working together on cancer research. Every international medical mission treating patients regardless of nationality. Every peace-building program emphasizing professional relationships across conflict lines carries forward what Fletcher and Yamamoto began in a medical tent on Guam in 1944. The mathematical equation they proved was simple but profound. Respect plus time plus consistent application equals transformation. Enemies can become colleagues. Colleagues can become friends. And friendships between former enemies can become foundations for lasting peace. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.